Hello everyone, welcome to SAP Technomaniac. In my previous video, we started with the application with the draft capabilities. We understood the draft, what is draft, and we created the read-only application for our draft scenario. In this video, we will add the behavior capabilities in our business object. We start with the authorization. Since we have missed the authorization part and the actions with parameter where we can use the abstract entity, those kind of lot of things we have missed in managed scenario or unmanaged scenario. In this video or in this application, we will cover what all are the concepts we have missed in my previous applications. So we will start with the authorization check. We understood what is authorization check and in what all are the scenario we can apply, and there are different type of authorization, instance and global. We will understand in detail and we will write the code in our authorization check method as well. Let's get started. Not only we have to define the authorization control for the read operation, we have to define the authorization control for the update operation as well. Read operation, when we are reading the database, we can easily apply the authorization control using the DCL because we are preparing our base objects or our structure using the CDS, and on top of CDS we can easily create the DCL, data control language, which I have explained in detail in my CDS view series. If you don't know how to create the DCL, inside the DCL how to call the auth object, I explained in my CDS series, you can watch out there. But reading part, not only we do from the database, we do from the transactional buffer as well. The two things here. First, we read the data from the database, and second, we read the data from the transactional buffer as well. Means from the application server where we have intermediately saved the data in the transactional buffer. When we read the data from the database, DCL will take care, but when we are reading the data from the transactional buffer, we have to take care. Again, there are two things, one in managed scenario, second in unmanaged scenario. In managed scenario, the reading the data from the transactional buffer, that time applying that auth object, that will be taken care by the framework. But in unmanaged scenario, if you are implementing the read operation to check the e-tag, to apply the feature control or to apply any other things, we have to, because we want to read the data from the transactional buffer, we discussed in detail in my unmanaged video. That time we have to take care this authorization control. We have to apply explicitly whenever we are reading directly or reading by association. At time we have to call this auth check, we have to apply this authority check, and then we have to read. Regarding the read operation, the one thing we have to make sure, we can't apply authorization check for the functions. You can apply the authorization check for all read operations, but if you have defined the function to read the data from some custom table or some other table, because there is CDS or data model is not involved, you are writing your own logic, so that is the reason we can't apply authorization check on the functions. If you want to apply, you have to write your own code inside the function itself and give the appropriate error. That time these DCLs will be not applicable and it will not make sense also. Now we talk about the modify operations. Modify operations, if you know from my previous videos, we do always on the transactional buffer, and during the save sequence we pick the data from the transactional buffer and we will save the data in the database. So before saving the data in the transactional buffer or modifying the data in the transactional buffer, we have to check the authorization. So this authorization always checked whenever you apply each create, update or delete operation on the transactional buffer, and during the diagrams or we can say flow of the this create, update and delete operation I have shown you where exactly the authorization check is calling. It's calling before actually we are doing the modification in the transactional buffer. It will be checked. If authorization is passed, then only we will update the transactional buffer, otherwise we will not update. So the before image, we can say the transactional buffer before modifying what is the data was there, that we call the before image of that BO. We will apply, we will check against the before image whatever the values are available in the transactional buffer. We will apply the authorization check based on those values. If the user have access, then only we will go further to modify that particular transactional buffer, that particular instance. Otherwise we will stop there only and we will give the appropriate message. So that is the reason, since it is applied on the BO whatever the existing values on the transactional buffer, based on that is the reason if some values coming which we want to update in the transactional buffer, against that if we want to do some authorization check, that we can't do in this particular method. To do this authorization check, we have to define this authorization in the behavior definition and we have to implement this in behavior pools. Again, there are multiple types of authorization, instance and global authorization. We will discuss in upcoming slide. But most important thing, whatever the existing data available on the transactional buffer, based on that only the authorization will be checked. It will be not checked based on the whatever you are sending now to update in the transactional buffer. So if you want to check that kind of thing, that you can do in the pre-check method. That is the reason I have written the same. You can do pre-check method. Inside the pre-check method you can do this kind of authorization if you want to check against the incoming values. We will discuss about this detail in the scenario wise, what scenario where we have to write in upcoming slide. But just to understand that if you want to do based on the existing BO instance which is available on the transactional buffer, that BO instance, the existing image which is available on the transactional buffer, if you want to do, you do always in this particular global and instance authorization. If you want to do against the incoming values which are coming now to update in the transactional buffer, based on that if you want to do, then you have to write those authorization in the pre-check method. Now we will discuss further in detail global authorization, instance authorization and authorization check against the incoming values. First thing, global authorizations. As you remember from my previous video, from unmanaged scenario, I have explained the flow of the methods, how it will be called whenever you do create, update, delete or any action or function. That time the first method will be called the global authorization method. Let me show you the first method. For example, in the update operation, not only update, in the create and delete operation also, the first method will be called the global authorization. In this method, we will check the user have access to do create, update and delete operation or not. If it is not having actions, we will give appropriate error and come out from that particular flow and the operation will be stopped there itself. This is called the global authorizations. For example, I want to give one example. Whenever we are creating the travel in our travel scenario, some user is not having to create the travel in the transactional buffer or in the database also. We will check the authorizations again, that user have access to create the travel or not. If he is not having the access, we will stop there only and we will give the error to the user. The thing is that global authorization can be applied not only on the static operations, it will be applied on the instance operations. Static and instance operation, you already know. Static operation will be bound to the entire BO. For example, the create operation will never bound to the particular instance, existing instance. For example, another example I can take, suppose I want to create one action button which will approve all the sales order which is open. I create one button. As soon as you click on that button, what all are the sales order open in the database, it will go and approve all. So those kind of operation is not bound to the particular sales order. It is bound to the entire BU. So that is called the static operations. And suppose we are doing some update operation or delete operation, that always bound to that particular sales order. That is called the instance operations. So global authorization will be applied on not only onto the static operations, it will be applied on the instance operation as well. So these are the example I can say. The second is the instance authorizations. The instance authorization will be called the later part of the flow before just updating the transactional buffer. Let me show you. So this we have called the global authorization, global feature control, log, e-takes, everything is done, and pre-checks also done, update, augmentation, everything is called. But just before the updating the database, trigger update, just before that we will call this particular authorization on the instance. In the instance authorization, we will check the authorization against the field values. For example, we are doing any operation on travel, or here I have example given on the manager changing the salaries. But before the any manager changing the salary, we have to check that particular employee which is belong to that particular manager or not. That checks we will do in this particular instance authorizations. If we want to do the checks against the value which is existing in the transactional buffer, what will be available in the instance authorization method? In the interface, we can say importing, exporting, importing parameter, you only will be available the keys for that particular instance which you want to change. For that, what is the keys available? Based on the keys, we will read the transactional buffer and we will read those values, and those values we will check that for those values that user have access or not to update those values. That we will do in the instance authorizations. In the instance authorization method, you can't do the authorization check against the static operations. You are doing some static operation like that, you are creating the purchase order or sales order, or you are doing any operation entire BO, that you can't do on this particular instance authorization, because instance authorization interface importing parameter will be having key. So for that particular BO we can't have key. So that is the reason instance authorization obviously will be applied to that particular instance operation only. It can't be applied on the static operations. So this is the basic difference between the global authorizations and the instance authorizations. Global authorizations will be belong to the static and instant operations, and the instance authorization only belong to the instance operations. The last thing, check against the incoming values. If you want to apply the authorization check against the incoming values which we have updated now, which is not available on the transactional buffer, that we want to do, that you can't do in the global and the instance authorization method. That you have to do in the pre-check method. In the pre-check method, the incoming values will be available. You can check those values if the user have access to update those values in the transactional buffer or not. We will check there itself and we will stop there itself user, and we will not go further to update the transactional buffer. For example, I want to give you example for better understanding. For example, any user whenever create the sales order, the amount, not any user, that particular user, if create the sales order, the sales order amount should be greater than 1000, then only that particular user should be able to create the sales order. Otherwise he should not able to create the sales order. So that kind of check I want to do. This kind of check we can do in the pre-check, because when the user will create the sales order, that time it will enter the amount value. Then that amount value will come to the pre-check method. We are checking the authorization against the incoming values, not the values which is available on the transactional buffer. So that is the reason that kind of checks we have to do in the pre-check method, and we have to check user entered the appropriate amount or not using the authorization object, and if it have entered, then we will follow further, otherwise we will stop there. And where it will be called in our flow, before the instance authorization, you can see the call pre-check implementation is called here. there are two kind of pre-check. One will be called at the projection layer and another will be called at the interface layer. Projection layer one called first and the interface layer one called later point of time. So these are the three important concept of authorization. We can see there are three kind of authorization: one on the global authorization, instance authorizations, and authorizations against the incoming values. Now we will discuss how we define the authorization in our behavior definition language or BDL. As we define in our managed scenario also, we always define the authorization in the characteristic part, where we define all the characteristic like use e-tag, authorizations, and the other total e-tag which we'll gonna define for the draft as well. Those all things we will define in the characteristic. So there also we have to define the authorization, and for each entity we should define either as a authorization master entity or as a authorization dependent entity. Our root entity must be authorization master entity, and our child entity can be authorization master entity or authorization dependent entity. If our child entity is an authorization dependent entity, that means the authorization will be derived from its parent entity or its root entity. So we have to give explicitly in the body part of our child entity association, we have to give which from where we are deriving the authorization, and then the declaration part of the our defined view entity of our child entity, we have to define like authorization dependent by association, and we have to give the association name. That association we should define, or we must define in our body part as well. So association to travel, then only it will work, otherwise it will not work. So these are the declaration part in our characteristic, and these are the declaration part in our body part. So in the declaration for the authorization master, just we have to define authorization master global. But now how it will work? Once we define the authorization master global and instance in the characteristic, and the body part for the child entity if it is authorization dependent, now we have to implement relevant global and instance method. Once you click on the control one, it will automatically define one method in your behavior pool. There will go and write the code. But the most important thing part, once you define for particular entity authorization master or authorization dependent, or any authorization you have defined for each operations available in that particular entity, CURD operations, create, update, delete, or any functions, not functions, actions, function it will be not derived, any action is available, or CUD operation, create, update, delete operations are available in that particular entity, then for those operations, those authorization which we define in the characteristic will be executed when those operation will be performed. Apart from that, if we want to do explicitly some additional authorization, or we want to avoid some authorization, then for along with those operation we can define authorization none or authorization update. That will tell along with the authorization which you are derived, you have to, or which you are defined, you have to define this authorization. Now for this operation, authorization of update operation you have to call. For this operation, authorization of global you have to call, or for this operation you have to call the instance authorization. That you can define explicitly in you along with your operation. That also we will see. Or if you don't want to apply the authorization, even you have defined in your characteristic, then you can define the authorization none. That this will be additionally you have to write along with your operation. When you write this thing, then it will overwrite whatever you have defined in the characteristic. Only these authorization will be called. Suppose you have defined in the characteristic both the global and instance authorization, but when you are defining the actions create, just call the global authorization. I don't want to call the instance authorization. Then in that case it will call only the global authorization. And the second thing, in these scenarios, these are the three scenarios when even you have defined the authorization as an instance, and you define the instance and global authorization in your define your entity. In these three scenarios, those authorization will be not executed. First, if you have defined action of authorization dependent entity, you have root entity as a master authorization and you have dependent entity that there we are defining authorization dependent by this particular your travel in the booking entity. In the booking entity you have defined some action. For those actions, authorization will be not derived from your root entity, even that is authorization dependent. For the actions you have defined in your child entity, and in the child entity you have defined the authorization dependent by travel or authorization dependent by root. In that case, you have to, if you want to execute the authorization on those particular actions which you define in the child entity, then you have to write those authorizations separately in the child entity. For the other operation like the update, delete and create by association, automatically derived from the parent. If it is authorization dependent by parent, it will be automatically derived, but the actions it will be not derived, you have to write separately. Second thing, create enable cross BO association. You have the another BO, and for that, based on the another BO root one entity, you want to create the child entity of this one. In that case also authorization will be not derived, you have to write the authorization separately. Third, create enable association with which are not to the child associations. For example, you define the BO. In the BO you didn't define the composition relationship, but still you are creating that associated entity based on the parent entity, but that composition relationship you didn't define in your BO. In that case also authorization will be not derived from the parent entity. So that is very associated entities there, we are creating that particular entity based on the association, but that is not the parent because we didn't define that composition relationship in our BO. In that case also the authorization will be not derived from the parent. So these are the some scenario where you have authorization dependent entity. That time also we have to make sure in these scenarios from the parent it will be not derived the authorization. Derived means it will be not called when those actions will be called, then the parent authorization will be not called. If you want to do some kind of authorization in that cases, you have to write for the child entity that authorization separately. But last most important thing, if a root entity is defined as a authorization master entity, then it is recommended that each child entity that is behavior enabled is defined as a authorization dependent entity. For example, you have root entity and behavior enable means you are create by association you are doing, or update by read by association you are doing. In that case you must define those child entity as a authorization dependent by parent. That is the rule. When we are defining, we have result relationship, then you must define in your child entity should be behavior enable. In that you have to define those child entity as a authorization dependent entity. So these are the some points you have to make sure whenever you work with the authorization. Now this authorization, how it is available in the each and every managed, unmanaged, and in your projection BO or in the draft scenario. In managed BO you define the global and instance authorization, you implement it in the behavior pool, it will call automatically without any issue. But in unmanaged BO you define the global authorization, it will be called like simply it will call the global authorization. But most important thing, in unmanaged RAP BO, if you define the instance authorization, those instance authorization during those update create operation will be not called. So you have to make sure if you want to define some authorization for the instance authorization, you have to write that instance authorization in that respective update, create and delete method itself. It will be not called by the framework those instance authorization. That you have to make sure whenever you do the update scenarios, put the breakpoint in your instance authorization, that will be not called. It happened in our unmanaged scenario as well. I didn't discuss that time authorization, but if you want to check that it out in unmanaged scenario, put where you are checking the instance authorization, put the breakpoint and try to execute any operation. It will be not called. Why it will be not called? In unmanaged scenario it will be not derived. But what if you define some instance authorization in unmanaged scenario, it will be only one impact. In case of UI scenario, the instance authorization control method has a effect on the RAP consumer hints. What that mean? That I will explain in this one, how the whenever you define some authorization for that particular, for example, you don't have access to suppose you define the global authorization and you don't have the create access for that particular BO. In that case, for that user, that create button itself will be removed from the UI. When before rendering the UI, those authorization will be checked, and only those button will be rendered which user have access. So in the same way, in unmanaged, in this scenario, where if you have defined the instance RAP BO, instance RAP authorization, even through this will be not called during the your transactional phase, but the impact will be if you don't have authorization, those will be not enabled. So that is the only UI side, it will be impacted if you define like that, but it will be not called. It is not called, but if you want to check the authorization, then you can write directly in the create, update, delete method. You don't need to write in the separate instance authorization method. And if you want to disable from the UI, when for that particular instance, when the authorization it is not there, as soon as user select that particular instance, if you don't have authorization for that instance, that particular actions, then you can disable using this particular instance authorization control. The UI reflection will be there, but it will not call that particular instance authorization. If you want to apply that instance authorization, what is the usefulness of that particular thing? If it is not available, it will be not called at all. But if you are calling that BO from other BO or some other program, and you want to do that authorization check, then you have to implement that authorization check in update, delete, and create operation itself, or actions, wherever you are doing. So these are the important thing. The last thing, when you are defining the authorization in the projection behavior, the first thing, whatever you define in the base BO, what all are the things where it is deriving those authorization, in the same way it will derive in the projection BO. For example, you use create, you have used in the create scenario in the base BO, where it is deriving from, it is deriving from global and instance. In the same way, in the projection will happen. But in one case, when you define some additional action in your projection level, that action is not available in your base BO, but you have defined the additional action in your projection layer. For that, if you want some authorization should run, in that case you have to define your authorization in projection layer separately, and you have to create one class, behavior pool class, in the projection layer separately. That is very important thing. And once you define that action here, like in base BO, we have the dependent by parent, or dependent authorization dependent by parent, that we can't do in the projection layer. You have to define for each and every entity separately authorization. So these all the things only I have written. There is no master and dependent relationship between the different projection definitions, and additionally you can define action with authorization none. If you don't want to define the authorization and you have used strict to in your authorization, in that case, if you use strict to, you have to obviously mandatorily define authorization, otherwise you will get the dump. But you have used the strict to and you don't want to define the authorization, in that case you just use authorization none in front of that action. In that case you will not get that dump. So that's a very important thing. So these are the RAP and last but most important thing, if you don't have any operation access and you are creating that particular UI from that particular service, that time those operation button automatically disabled from the UI. If you don't have the create, delete, and update access, those UI button will be disabled. We have seen this thing in my previous videos. If you are using use create, use update, but some user is not having that access, then that will be before the rendering of those buttons, the authorization also will be checked. Once the authorization checked, if you don't have authorization to perform that operations, those buttons also will be disappeared from your UI. That is very important thing. Role will be played when you create any operation. For example, I have given one example. The action set status booked can only be executed for instance whose status isn't booked yet, and by user that are assigned to a specific role. If you have some role to book that particular, to set that that status booked, that particular authorization you have, then only that particular button will be displayed, otherwise it will be not displayed. That's very important thing. So without wasting the time, we will create our behavior definition, we will define the authorization, we will implement the authorization. In my last video, we have created the read-only application. Now, for that read-only application, we will add the transactional behavior and we will see For that, first we have to add the transactional behavior at the base BO. I have base root entity called the GR travel underscore D. On top of that, I will create the behavior definition, and for the projection I will create on top of ZC travel underscore A underscore D. So let me create the behavior definition on the travel root entity. And we will give the name of the behavior definition always similar to the GR travel underscore D, and in this case we are using the managed scenario with the draft that we will define obviously in the behavior definition. First we will create entire application without draft, then we will add the draft capabilities. Click on next button, select the appropriate TR and click on finish button. It will add the behavior definitions. So these are all the things, the different type of the implementations, what is a strict mode, what is persistent table, what is lock master, lock dependent, and today we discuss authorization master and authorization dependent as well in my managed scenario, and whatever it is pending we will cover in this draft scenario. First what we will do, we will remove the error from this particular behavior definition. So I can see I am getting one error here. First I will remove this one. The field travel UUID is used for parent dependency. This means it should be flagged as a read only. Since we are using this particular association, we are using the, as I told you in my authorization scenario also, whenever we will define the authorization master as a root entity and authorization dependent by parent entity, that time we have to define this particular association explicitly. That is done by framework or that is generated by the code. And just what we have to make sure, since this we have defined this association between this book travel entity and booking entity, and this in this travel entity, this travel UID is a key field and this is also in read only. So we have to make sure in the booking as well this field should be read only. So that only we are getting the error and we have to remove the error. So for that, Control Alt arrow down button, and I will make this travel UUID Control C as a read only. I didn't edit this particular travel UUID along with the booking UUID. I will tell you why I didn't edit. The same thing I will do since we define the association to this particular travel and booking, and in this travel and booking we have the some read only field that should be defined in child entity as well, read only. I'm getting the same error which we got above. If you hover here, the field travel UID used for the lock and authorization dependency, this means it should be flagged as a read only. Let me make this field as a read only. Control Z, Control Alt arrow down button, and I will make this, okay, I make this Control C. I did Control Z. Let me put again. Here also I will put Control V, and along with this I will put the booking UUID as well. So now all error got removed, but I want to remove the warning as well. I don't want any warning. The first warning, this particular class does not exist. I want to implement all the classes not at the root level. For each entity I want to declare the separate class for our behavior pool implementation, and this is also recommendation by the SAP. You should have different implementation for each class. That we will do later. First remove this other warnings. The key field of the table does not map to the, now we have to define the mapping. So for the mapping, I don't want to create one by one mapping. I have already code. So let me do the travel mapping first. Basically we are mapping back to the CDS entity because we have changed the name in the CDS entity from the table. So let me do the mapping for the travel. In the CDS entity I have name agency ID, and in my table I have the agency underscore ID. I have to map back those fields. So whenever we are doing the implementation, so framework can understand which field should be mapped to which field. So this CDS entity field should map to the this fields. Same way, the warning got removed. Still I have one warning. The read only field should be flagged as a numbering managed. So in this case, since this is the key field and we have made this field as a read only, we are not allowing the user to update this particular key field. So they are expecting us, if you are not allowing user to fill this field, then you should make this as a managed early in numbering. So we have to make this field numbering managed. So let me define this field as a numbering. You can do control space and numbering managed and comma separated you can give. I have removed this warning as well. For the root entity, now I don't have any warning. Let me go to my child entity. It is expecting us again for the mapping. So let me define the mapping for my child entity as well. Booking entity, control C and control V. The warning got removed. I got another warning. I have to, this field is a read only. So you have to define numbering managed for this also, because we are using, sorry, we are using managed internal early numbering because we have UUID field. Otherwise the framework telling if you are not defining numbering managed, then this field should not be read only because it is the key field. The user should enter either some value or you should define numbering managed. Same thing we are doing, and same thing we have to do for the booking supplement as well. We have to define first the mapping, control C, back to the table. It's very easy. I have explained this all the things in my managed scenario as well. And here again this field should be numbering managed. So that is the reason I have declared this other field separately, because this is the key field. I have to define the numbering as well apart from read only. For other field I no need to define the numbering here. So that is the reason I have copied and then made them read only. So I didn't have any warning now. Let me activate this one. Control F3. Since this is the managed scenario, create, update, delete, everything will be available by default. Let me test this service. So open the service binding. I have activated this one. I have still one warning. This implementation is missing. So let me remove this warning also. I don't want to do any implementation at the root level. I want to define each and every implementation. So in this case, at the entity level, let me define at least one class. So in this case, ZBP R_travel D. So I think we have to give the class name as per the naming convention. I have created one temporary class ZBP_travel_. This is not the base level, so I am giving the travel_A_D, or D we can give. For the booking, I will give ZBP booking_D, and for the booking supplement, ZBP booking supplement_D. You can do control 1, create the behavior implementation for that. Control 1. Let me activate this one first. Control F3. Control 1. Create behavior implementation for that. Let me click on next button. Let me click on finish. It will create the behavior pool class. In this, you can see we have get instance authorization method automatically defined, because in our base BO you can see we have authorization master as an instance. As of now we define as an instance, so that is the reason it defined this method. Whatever the authorization we will declare here, those authorization will be executed. Apart from that, other entities we have authorization dependent entities. So this is again guideline also. If you create your unmanaged scenario also, if you have the create by association and composition relationship, you should have child entities always is a authorization dependent by, as we have discussed in theory part as well. So as I told you, whenever you execute any create, update and delete operation, that time this authorization will be executed before doing any operation. Let me activate this one, Control F3. We have activated our base definition and the behavior pool class. Now to actually this operation work on our application, we have to define the BO business object, or we have to complete the business object at the projection layer as well. For that, I have to click on the projection root entity, right click on that, create new behavior definition at the projection BO level. Let me click on the next button. The name will be similar to your root entity, the behavior definition name, and you can click on next button, select appropriate TR and click on finish button. So in this case, by default, use create, use update, use delete, create by association, everything is coming by default. You no need to define here use authorization, because that will be automatically derived all the authorization from the base. But if you are defining some action separately here, then for that you have to define the authorization separately here. The actions will not derive those actions if you are defining at the projection layer. I'm talking about those actions, not those actions which is already defined on the base behavior definition. If you have some new actions here defining at the projection layer, for that you have to define separately authorization here, and you have to create the behavior pool separately at the projection layer as well. So that we have discussed in theory part. Let me activate this also, Control F3. I didn't get any warning, and let me try to execute one by one all the operations. So select the service binding, select get the root node, click on preview button. My application is loading. So you can see, I can see the create, delete, all the buttons. Since it is managed scenario, no need to worry, everything will work perfectly. So let me click on go button. So as I told you, we have breakpoint on the instance method. So since this is the managed scenario, your global and instance method will be called by framework automatically. So let me do F8. Before reading the data, it just called that one. For unmanaged scenario, you have to make sure, because managed scenario they have did this thing. For unmanaged scenario, this instance method will be not called. Only the global method will be called. Instance method only replicated only your UI part that we have discussed in theory part, and we will try to see here as well. But because we don't have any as of now any unmanaged scenario, we have the managed scenario. If you define both the method, instance and global authorization, both will be called. No need to worry. Let me click on one. Let me create random travel. Oh, travel ID field should be, in this case, it should be read only. Since ideally it should be read only. We have to define, but as of now, let me give some random number 9999 starting date, because we have travel UID. But as of now, to test what all the things are working, total price should be automatically derived like we did in the managed scenario and unmanaged scenario. Let me give some USD. Agency ID, let me give some random agency ID, and date, let me give some random date, and we have to check the dates also. I didn't implemented any validation determination. This total price ideally should be derived from the determination based on these values. Customer ID, let me give some customer ID number, and let me give the same number here, USD. Automatic, ideally the total price should be the combination of booking supplement, and the all the booking and relevant booking supplements. So in this case, I have to give some description, test, and the status is open. Let me click on the create button. As soon as you click on create button, it will check again for the instance and global both authorization, since it is the managed scenario. If it is unmanaged scenario, it would have not called. Let me click on F8. Come to the UI, you can see the 999, it got successfully created. If you want to edit, you can edit, test edit, you can click and click on save button. Since it is the managed scenario, we don't need to do any implementation. The CUD operation will work out of the box. So let me see the table is updated with this value or not. Let me see, try and see if it is not updated, or we can test like this also. You can come back. Since it is the, again we are reading the data, again it is checking the authorization. Let me do F8. So you can see it got created successfully as well. And in the system also you can see, let me come to the ZBP travel, let me come to the ABAP perspective, and my table I have to go, base table, this one. Let me do F8, go to descending order. You can see the travel UUID created by the framework, and you have the new travel ID. Ideally this also should be generated internally, the user should not enter. We will do that kind of thing, but as of now you can see everything is working perfectly. We have created travel successfully without doing anything. All other fields, last change date, local last change date field is filled by the framework because we have given the appropriate annotations. So in the same way, just last thing, just select this one and click on delete. Yes, I want to delete, and in that way we can check the delete operation also working without any implementation. But this is not the ideal application at all. We have to make this ideal application. We have to put a lot of validations, determinations, actions and other things. Again, this video is becoming a little bit longer as well. In my next week, what I will do, I will define the not only the instance authorization, I will define the global authorization also, and we will implement both the authorizations, and we will see how it is triggering each and every time, and based on the values how it is impacting on our application. Before going to that video, please subscribe this channel, like this video, whatever you are feeling, write it down in comment section, and not only that, please share these videos with others as well. With that, thank you and happy learning.